Okay, as I mentioned, this presentation does use some imagery that may not be appropriate for children. So please, if you're at home and you have a lot of children around, please make sure you play close attention to your screen. As I said, I give this presentation publicly to a bunch of different organizations and everyone everywhere, and imagery speaks 1,000 words. So, all right. So as I mentioned, what we want to talk about is what makes it a condition in which a person will harm another person. And the first thing we need to do is give definition, some type of operational, or what we call operational definition. Okay. So for the sakes of this class, when we're defining evil, we're defining it as the exercise of power. And you remember, we've already talked about conflict theory, where when there's unequal power in a situation, it's a situation in which people will take advantage of other people. So it's the power to intentionally, and intentionality is important. As we will get into different homicides, we'll see, the common association is that they're loaded up on drugs or alcohol or something that makes them do something. But we'll find out later that actually, for example, when it comes to domestic homicide, less than 50% of women who commit domestic homicide, and less than, I think it's about 60% of men who commit domestic homicide are drunk or on some type of illicit drug. So that means about 50% of homicides that occur on the domestic level, there is no drugs or alcohol or anything involved. And that's where we say intentionality is important, because it's someone making a choice to do this behavior. Okay. So it's intentionally harm someone psychologically, hurt someone physically, and destroy someone morally. Okay. And again, we can look at things like child abuse. We can look at things like domestic violence, sexual violence, and they all have these three goals in mind. Okay. When you take someone and you harm them because you have more power than they do, you're harming them psychologically, physically, and morally all at the same time, because you're taking away their choice, you're destroying their body, and you're destroying the way they view and think about the world. Okay. So kind of keep this definition in mind as we move along. And then let's take so we're going to focus here for a little while on homicide, which the most basic definition of homicide is when a person intentionally kills another person or ends the life of another individual. Okay. And in our world, we've had different reasons why people enter into homicidal behaviors. Either they feel threatened. There's the crime of passion argument. There's the psychopathology argument. And of course, some that we have question marks next to is mental illness, or that they have a gun. So let's kind of go through each one of these. So the notion of threat, we often see in areas where they are what we call economically, or they occur in very deprived communities where people harm other people in order to gain resources. Okay, so a portion of homicides can be linked to areas of economic deprivation, which we will see when we look at what are the sociological predictors of homicide, and we'll see that in a minute. Okay. Crimes of passion, we will see that a good majority of domestic homicides can be put in this category. In fact, we've seen this on the rise, specifically with domestic homicide and homicide between intimate partners. It has actually been on the rise. Things like jealousy and those types of things, and cheating behaviors and those kinds of things that deal with passion. Those have actually been on the increase over the last decade or two. Interestingly, when we get to this graph, it interestingly starts with the creation of things like Facebook and Instagram. And there's a direct association between homicide because of passion and the advent of social media, which is kind of an interesting kind of thought. It's a correlation, it's not causal, but it's interesting to think about. Psychopathology, we will actually spend quite a bit of time talking about psychopathology and what are called serial killers. But psychopathology, and we'll define it all later and whatnot, the thing I want you to keep in mind is psychopathology only accounts for about 3% of homicides, meaning that the Ted Bundys and the other guys, I can't remember right now, I'm sorry, it's Monday, but the Ted Bundys of the world, they only represent about 3% of homicides that happen in the United States and across the globe. In fact, there's certain areas of the world where psychopathology was unheard of until contact with Western countries. So we'll talk about that. Thomas, so the words psychopath and sociopath actually mean the same thing. They're a synonymous term with each other. I prefer the term psychopath because we will see that it has more to do with the individual than with their social environment. Now, there is something, and we'll get to this, called antisocial personality disorder. The difference between psychopathology and antisocial personality disorder is those with antisocial personality, it's a disorder. Psychopathology and sociopathology are not considered disorders. So, but we'll get to that. And thank you for bringing that up. I should put psychopathology / sociopathology. So, what about mental illness? Because we hear this with mass shootings and that call for better mental health services and everything. Every time we hear a mass shooting or a school shooting, what is the link between mental illness and homicide? And to be honest with you, it's more of a folk mythology that mental illness can cause someone to commit homicide. Now, I'm not going to say that it makes a person with mental illness immune to homicide or committing homicide, but the link between mental illness and homicide is very, very weak. But what we'll see is we need to differentiate between mental illness and mental health. Okay. Mental health, meaning that you have all of your social needs, psychological needs, and physical needs taken care of. That's mental health. And we can see that when any of these three areas are deprived, that then creates that power differential where a possible homicide can occur. But does mental illness such as post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, or even any of the personality disorders, does that create someone who is more prone to homicide? The answer is no. For example, a person who truly has depression or clinical depression, they're too depressed to even plan a homicide. They'd rather escape from the world. I've heard about schizophrenia. Does it cause people to commit homicide? The truth is no. The voices, you've heard on popular TV that schizophrenia, they heard voices and that's what made them kill someone and whatnot. Well, the truth behind that is most of the voices a schizophrenic hears are about self-harm, not about harm to other people. And in fact, if you want one of the safest places to live, it would be in a home that specializes in schizophrenia. You're less likely to be hurt by someone with schizophrenia than you are by someone who doesn't have schizophrenia. When we do get people who say that they heard voices that promoted them to commit their crime, that is usually due to drug elicitations that give symptoms similar to schizophrenia, such as methamphetamine, cocaine, and stimulant type drugs. Okay, so the question about mental illness is, does mental illness cause homicide? The answer is not really. They're at the same risk as everybody else. But does a mental health situation, deprivation of social, psychological, and biological needs, can that promote the potential of a homicide? The answer to that is yes. And then the last one is on the gun debate. Do guns cause homicide? And of course, on one side, they say yes with no explanation. On the other side, they say no, it's a person who pulls the trigger that commits the homicide. But the situation, the association between guns and people is a little bit more complicated than those simple answers, okay? Because we know that the mere presence of a gun increases aggression. This goes back to studies where we measured aggression when someone saw a gun in a gun rack in a vehicle versus not seeing a gun rack in a vehicle. And we see that people, when they see a gun in a gun, tend to drive more aggressively. They tend to act more aggressively. We see that in other psychological and neurological studies, when we have someone in a brain scanner and we show pictures of a bunny rabbit versus a knife versus a gun versus a rock. And when the gun is shown, the amygdala, which is associated with aggression, lights up like a Roman candle. It's fully and totally active. So in the presence of the gun, it can increase.
Can you keep the lights come on enough? You don't expect anybody else?
I don't think so.
Okay,
I think we're about it.
Because I really like the doors, I can see you sitting in there.
Oh, well, we only need an exit, so.
Oh, I mean, I can unlock one of the doors if you're expecting anybody.
Oh, no, I don't think we're expecting anyone else tonight.
Okay.
All right. All right, thank you. And the association between aggression and the probability in a situation to commit a homicide is present. Okay, and so does a gun cause homicide? The answer is no. Does it increase aggression? The answer is absolutely yes. We haven't seen a study that has countered the aggression effect of a gun. So does that aggression then increase the probability of a homicide occurring? Yes, it does. So that is kind of the association, the more of explanation. And that's also what complicates everything, is there's not this direct link between gun ownership and homicide, but there is a direct link between a gun and aggression's linked to homicide. So that's the complicated part about the gun debate and gun ownership debate. And what has recently been explored, especially for example with school shootings, okay, is that if you're in a situation where you feel threatened, where you're belittled, when you're pushed to the edge, when you're seen as vulnerable, okay, in a country that defines guns as a source of protection, one way to protect yourself with that elevated level of aggression is to protect yourself with a gun. And so that actually is one of the leading theories that is being explored with school shootings, because we do know that the majority of individuals who commit school shootings, there was a history of bullying with these individuals, a history of social isolation, and those types of things. So the current kind of leading theory that is being explored is the vulnerability, the cultural association with protection and guns, and the increased aggression that guns have when they're in the presence of an individual. So just kind of a sideline on that debate at the moment. Okay. So that's where they are. Now, when we look at homicides over the last several decades, believe it or not, even with our televised inoculation of school shootings, homicides, all these kinds of things, homicides as a whole have actually been going down for several decades. They're about at a fourth of the level as they were in the 1970s and the 1980s. But there is one type of homicide that is on the increase, that is becoming more and more common, and is actually one of the more leading causes of homicide that we see, other than the ones that deal with aggression, such as school shootings. And that is infant homicides. This is individuals between the age of 0 and 2. This has been, as we've seen, overall homicides on the decrease, infant homicides have been on the increase. And this is nothing new to a society. We can look through history and we can see that, well, when aggression among adults goes down, aggression to children go up. And so this isn't something that is a new finding. It actually goes with historical trends from a sociological perspective. And there's some theories about why infant homicide has going up that we'll see here a little bit later. Again, it goes back to environmental and community contingencies. There's been some theories, such as frustration theory, about the reduced number of resources that are available to a family today, and this need for 24-hour care basically with an infant becomes frustration. It's kind of the same thing with unwanted burden theory. The infant was a good idea during pregnancy, but once the work kind of sets in, then the parent feels that burden. They are no longer able to do the things they want to do, and so they commit on that level. Hey, Thomas, I'll actually get to that question in just a minute. Thomas asked about weapons and suicide. Okay. And the basic answer to your question is yes. One of them, well, it's kind of complicated, but we'll get to it. We'll get to it. I don't want to give you the short answer right now. Okay. So this is just an example of different states in the United States that tend to have relatively low homicide rates. So Minnesota, Washington, Idaho, Montana tend to have lower homicide rates than others. But we can see, for example, in Austria as well, we can see that the rates of homicide of infants is almost double to larger than the rates of homicide to adults. And of course, this one is all ages here, so it's a combination of both. So this is under 1 year, this is over 1 year. And we can see that really one of the only countries we can compare ourselves to that homicides is greater in the non-infant years is Ukraine, and other countries. But this is kind of the trend that's going on with ours, and Austria is kind of a comparable country to what we're seeing here in the United States. And here's another example. As we can see, adult homicides, this is males. who are the victim in this case. We can see, okay, adult homicides are still high, but they're trending downwards. But then when we see baby, infants, and children, we see that these homicides are trending upwards, okay? And we see a similar thing with females. So, no. With females, we see that during baby, infancy, and childhood, they're on the increase, while as adults, they're on the decrease, okay? And the other thing that we can note, and I think this is starting to get to kind of Thomas's question, is what is the association between suicide rates and infant homicide rates? And if you look at this blue line, there's actually a direct, kind of a almost direct association between suicide rates and infant homicide rates. So as infant homicide rates go up, suicide rates go up, okay? Now, is this a causal link? We don't know. We really haven't figured out what the association between suicide and homicide is. And Brittany, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I just want to know, like, what about like postpartum? And when we're talking about infant homicide, like, what about postpartum? Like, is there like any connection there?
So, you know what, Brittany, let me write that down. I'm going to write that question down because I haven't seen anything, but that doesn't mean there's nothing out there. So I'm going to write that question down and remind me of it on Wednesday.
Okay, yeah, no problem. It's just interesting to me because when you said it was on the rise, I can definitely see it. I mean, I think we all were in our like crime documentary era at one point, and I've seen a few just about, you know, mothers and them and their postpartum and just suffering from it, which, you know, they made a linkage like it could be that because of why, you know, they decided to, you know, drown their kids or drive off a cliff. And so I just was curious if there was any connection there. But yeah, I'll definitely remind you Wednesday.
Yeah, remind me on Wednesday because, you know, it kind of fits in, like, for example, with the frustration or burden theory of infant homicide. And I can kind of see that. But let me do a little research and then we'll get back to that on Wednesday. Thank you for that question. That's a very interesting question to look into. Okay. So again, I just want to give some sociological numbers for what we're dealing with here in the United States. So these are non-psychopathic adult homicides, okay? And as you'll see, they take up the majority of homicides here in the United States, okay? To where greater than 50% of homicides are due to intimate partner homicides, or what we call familicides. So this is, you know, a brother killing a brother, for example, and the like. So families make up greater than 50% of homicides in the United States. Intergroup conflict. So this is, you know, in our modern, well, in past times, we could talk about things like lynchings, hate homicides that are done through hate and those kinds of things. They make up a little bit more than 30% of homicides. So this can also be what, you know, gang wars, those types of intergroup conflicts. And then less than 9%, depending on the research that you read, are done by psychopaths, which right now we'll define a psychopath as someone who gets a thrill out of the killing process. It fulfills some type of fantasy, or it fulfills some type of need the individual has, okay? One thing that we should note, of the 26 modern countries, the United States has the highest homicide rate. We average between 5 to 6 per 100,000, where the other 26 modern countries have a homicide rate of less than 1.7 for every 100,000. So what's defined as a modern country? It's basically, are they within the technology era? Are they industrialized? Do they provide some type of living and homes and more modern type living arrangements for their citizenship? And we find that there's about 26 countries that meet that criteria. And so again, I hear this a lot, while homicide rates aren't as bad as Mexico, or bad as Brazil, or bad as other places, but it's kind of like, well, who should we be comparing ourselves to? Second or third world countries, or should we be comparing ourselves to the other modern countries? And when we do that, we find that we're in pretty sad shape compared to other countries.
You have a black vehicle?
A what?
A black vehicle?
No, mine's orange.
Okay, somebody left their parking lights on.
Oh, no.
No, you guys didn't.
Oh,
They're two ladies.
Oh,
And somebody's been there.
Yeah, she- huh.
Every somebody's been there. All right.
Hopefully. All right. The other thing we should note is, of the 26 modern countries, the United States has the highest incarceration rate. In fact, if we want a comparable country to compare to, what we know, which our knowledge is limited, is the most comparable country that we would have to look at is North Korea, and what we think their incarceration rates are. But a lot of those can be validated very well. But and then the other thing that we can see from a sociological perspective is homicide rates on a national level seem to mostly be associated with the militarization of police forces and a more individualistic mindseted culture. Okay, and so we can measure this on a state by state and community by community level. So when we talk about militarization of police forces, we're talking about police that become almost paramilitary in their actions. They see the citizens as potential combatants to them and to their community. They don't see the community as productive citizens, as you would say. Okay, Thomas, please step away. You're okay. All right. And so, and then the other type of policing is what we call community policing. This is where the police force sees communities and individuals in the communities as allies, as individuals who are part of keeping the community safe. Okay. What do we find when militarization increases? Well, we find that as militarization, so they base this on purchasing decommissioned military equipment. As we find that when police forces increase that, there's a lag, but then there's an increase in violence that just follows that militarization. So, and then the individualistic culture thing is, we see states and communities who tend to have high homicide rates also tend to have an higher individualistic mindset, meaning that my individualistic is that the focus of attention is on the individual's performance and individual responsibility. My successes are my successes, my failures are my failures, versus what we call more collective communities, where there's a responsibility to the community, to the family, So in a collective culture, you would say, when I fail, my family fails. When I succeed, my family succeeds. And so that's kind of the difference. And from a sociological perspective, we see as those two forces increases, at least on the community level, we see increases in aggression and harm. Now, how about numbers of perpetrators? So, of course, the highest number, and it's not included in here, is one individual committing against another individual. But we can see as the number of perpetrators increases, the number of homicides that have happened decrease. So the highest rate would be an individual, the second would be a second person. So the more people that are present, the less likely a homicide will occur. Now, to the question of the association between suicide and homicide, we see that as suicide rates are high, homicide rates tend to be low, okay? And then and vice versa. So it seems that if we're not harming each other, we tend to harm ourselves. And so this goes back to the question about the infant homicide thing. Postpartum is really kind of a detriment on the individual. That's why I kind of want to look into that a little bit closer. I appreciate that question. Okay, and we see the same thing with males and females, especially as age increases. Okay. So I want to talk again more on the sociological level. What are some community associations with homicide rates? Okay, so here we have the ones I want. So this top line is homicide rates. Okay, and then 2 through 6. While all of them are kind of what you would say sociological measures, okay? But these right here, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 tend to be the highest predictors. These numbers right here are what we call predictive numbers. So one predicts another at some rate, okay? And we can see that the things that tend to be highly associated with homicide rates tends to be what's called Gini, or inequality within a community. So when there's a large amount of inequality, we tend to see homicide rates high. Infant mortality rates, as they're high, homicide rates are high. Poverty index, this is a negative association. As poverty decreases, homicides decrease. As poverty increases, as poverty gets worse, I should say, homicide rates increase, okay? And then something called the development index. This index is how developed is a community compared to other communities. And the less developed a community is, the higher the homicide rates. And then the other one that tends to predict it well is something we call economic growth. So how much investment for the economy is in a community also predicts homicide rates. The less investment into economic growth, the higher the homicide rate, okay? Now, these other things that we've looked at, such as things like sex ratios between men and women, how dense a population is, because, you know, urban areas tend to get a rap for being highly violent. They tend not to predict it very well. And population size tends not to be predictive of homicides. So I think the only, at least here in the United States, the only one that population density plays a role in is Chicago, which tends to have a very high homicide rate. But beyond that, we see homicide rates between urban and rural areas about the same. And then, of course, there's always the question about immigration and homicide. And I think this one is very interesting. Is if we look at this scale, so here at with these negative numbers, this means we're bringing in less immigrants into the country than our population growth. Okay. When you see the positive numbers, this means immigration is higher, that we're bringing in more individuals into our country. Okay. And what we see is that the more people we bring into the country, the less homicide there is. The more we isolate ourselves from the rest of the world and not allowing and being closing our borders, the higher the homicide rate is. So that notion that was promoted, I think, in the 2016 elections, where something was said about we need to close our borders and put fences up because they're bringing the rapists, the murderers, and all those into our country. That is pretty much debunked by this graph here. That's again a social myth that we've created for ourselves. Now, let's talk a little bit about gender and age as it's associated with homicide rates. Okay. Because there is an association between birth rates of women between the age of 15 to 19 and poverty, as it's mentioned here, or inequality rates, okay? And as you can see right here, the United States, the association between young individuals and inequality is huge. And so we see their birth rates high. We see that the inequality is high, okay? Now, I bring this slide up because what we'll also see is that birth rates for girls between 15 and 19 years of age, as that increases, the homicide rate increases. So there's something about birth rate for this particular age group that predicts homicide rates. And we can see here, for example, here we are in Arizona. Here, I'll do the little pin thing. We look at Arizona right here, we can see as the age of women, the number of women having infants that are aged 15 to 19 is associated with our homicide rate, which right now is sitting around 8 per 100,000. And there's this association between that age group and homicide. And we don't find this for the other age groups. Okay, there's something unique about this age that we're trying to understand. We also, there's also an association between the age at which a woman has an infant and things like child abuse and even domestic violence, okay? Indeed, when we look at Hawaii as an example of child abuse, in the 80s and early 90s, Hawaii had one of the largest child abuse rates in the United States. But they decided to do something called a nurse visitation program. And what they did is if a female came in, they couldn't do it with adolescents. So it was a female between the age of 18 to 22 came in and had a baby at a hospital. They would assign a nurse visitor to go weekly in the beginning. And then kind of as the infant developed, the nurse visits would decrease to monthly to 6 months and so on. But one of the, so it was labeled as a health check. But when the nurse visitors went, they would also give parenting lessons and teach young mothers how to be young mothers, how to care for them, how to protect them, all of those kinds of things. And what they did in less than a decade and a half is they went from one of the highest child abuse rates to one of the lowest child abuse rates. Okay. Now, is this to blame those young mothers? Absolutely not. Because as we just saw in the previous slide, this age group tends to have the lowest amount of resources available to them in order to make sure that they have a strong, healthy life. And so to say it's because of women between the age of 15 to 19, that's a bad thing. It doesn't put it at risk, but we also have to look at the sociological reasons why that age group is such at high risk. And it tends to be the inequality that exists for that age group of women that tend to increase that chance of homicide. Okay. And so let's look at this then from, if you remember, we at the beginning of the semester, we talked about what's called the macro, a meso, and the individual level of analysis. Okay. And what we see here is again, some of the three basic issues surrounding homicide. So we have poverty, we have family disruptions measured by things like divorce rate, and we have racial composition. On the macro level, which we would consider the neighborhood and community, we see that on the poverty to lower, we see what's called the disorganized in the community, meaning that there's not much community cohesiveness in these communities. I think the best analogy is if I were to ask what the name of your neighbor is and their last name as well. If you can name your neighbors, you're 12% of the population. Because when we measure how many Americans know their neighbor, only about 12% actually can recall what their neighbor's name is. But when that becomes even worse, you don't recognize even your neighbors. You don't even have any interaction with your community in those. That tends to increase the chances of homicide. Okay. And of course, when we look at the family level, there's this saying that the family is the base of any community. And we see that the family, based on things like divorce rate, tend to create a situation where there's not a cohesive community. And there's lack of social control and cohesion within the family, which then relates to the community. Okay. And then when we look at racial composition, we can definitely look at the difference between Black and white communities. And large proportion of Blacks live in high poverty, and highly segregated neighborhoods. And so that increases the propensity of homicide. Okay. And again, I think that the important part of this, just like with the female example, does skin color determine homicide? The answer is no. The circumstances that a person is in tends to. So high poverty, high segregation, low community cohesiveness. And when you don't have the resources and the economic stance to lift yourself out of that, that puts you in an environmental situation that can increase the chances of a crime. Okay. So let's look at the meso level. This is the family interpersonal level. We see on the community or poverty level, harsher and less consistent discipline. We see high levels of conflict in relationships and frequent use of physical force as the poverty index increases, okay, and education decreases. On the family disruption level, we see high levels of conflict within relationships. There's definitely, and we all can see this, adverse effects and divorce and instability. tend to come from families of insufficient supervision and monitoring of children and their friendships and relationships. Again, these are all descriptive things that we have found that put people at risk. And then on the family level, on the racial level, we see again that access to things such as high quality education, employment opportunities, tend to then again influence these numbers. And then on the individual level, okay, again, when we look at for example, organic survival, when we look at poverty and education level, we know that people who are their survival is threatened to a level will enter into aggression and means to make it sure that they survive. Lack of skills with conflict, and lack of hope or brightness for a future. And if you have generation and generation that is continually in poverty and continually failing to thrive, your hope for your future tends to decrease. Okay. And then again, on the family level, on the individual, it's lack of interpersonal skills, those kinds of things that tend to be predictive of the complexity. And this is, I think, the important thing, the complexity of homicide. That for the majority of homicides, there's so many situational variables that are involved that just simply saying one person is to blame and whatnot tends to not pan out, even though everyone should have to pay for their crime. And I don't want to state that sociology and psychology are not excusiology, but we're trying to explain the conditions where these things can happen. Okay. This is the graph I was referring to, and this trend line is still increasing. That this blue line right here represents this number that I'm talking about. So what do we find are the main reasons for familicide and intimate partner violence or homicide? And there tends to be 4 main reasons that we see for these interfamily homicides. Family disputes, so disputes over, who gets grandma's house or something like that. Wordy quarrels where wording gets out of control, where anger starts to play a role. Personal anonymity, meaning that you have a mean feeling about someone, I guess is the best way to put that. And then love affairs. And as we can see, just as we can predict, so personal anonymity has kind of stabilized. We can see 300-400 levels. The one that has been but if you notice, these other ones tend to be on the decrease. The one that has significantly increased is the notion of love affairs, meaning cheating on each other. And as we can see, this has steadily increased. And again, the association with this number is access to social media and being able to, see your partner openly, sometimes flirting or engaging other people in a love type of triangle. Okay. And as we note here, this has been on the increase since about 2008. Before about 2008, these numbers were pretty stable, ranging between 100 to 185. But after 2008, we see that this one has been on a steady increase, which is kind of an interesting thought process. Okay. So let's focus now a little bit on intimate homicide, because this tends to be the highest level of homicide that we see in in the United States, at least, and in England, Britain, or United Kingdom, one of those three names, if you'd like to use it. We do know men engage in this behavior more than women, but over the past several decades, we've seen an increase in female offenders. And when we get to serial killing and the type of offenders, we can see that over the last couple decades, women have started to kill for the same reason men do. So, for example, before about 1999, you would find very few women who killed for sexual reasons. But ever since about 1999, we've seen women start to engage in murder for some type of sexual gratification purpose. So that'll be an example we'll come up with, and we can see the same thing in intimate partner homicide. Okay. I've always been asked, what about the LGBT communities? Are they immune to this type of evil? And the answer is no. Ever since we've used good research methods and been able to do unbiased research on LGBTQ communities, ever since about 2012, we find that among LGBTQ, domestic violence rates and domestic homicide rates don't go down because you're in a different relationship than the male-female relationship. So there is no immunity by a person that you love, whether it be male or female. Okay. The other thing that we know is about 83% occur in the home. 44% to 62% of offenders were intoxicated. So again, this brings up the statistic. This means that on average, 50% tend to be intoxicated, which means the other 50% committed this crime with a very clear mind, not an intoxicated mind. Okay. A lot of people have asked or theorized, do women kill because of victimization? The question is yes and no. About 1 in 4 women kill because of domestic violence victimization, but that means 3 out of 4 kill for a different reason. Okay. The question of do men kill out of jealousy and loss of control in a relationship? This one is mostly true. We find that about 86% of men kill for this reason, whether they feel jealous about a female's male friendship or their partner's friendship with someone else, or they feel like that partner might be sneaking around behind their back. And they feel a loss of control in the relationship, that they cannot maintain the relationship as it is. And that tends to be one of the main reasons men do. So that question on the social level is true. And we also find that 68 or 2/3 of men had a history of being an intimate partner, violent relationship, either as a victim or an offender. So for women, does a history of violence really predict homicide? The answer is sometimes. For men, does a history of a partner violence play a role? The answer is most likely. Okay. I'm gonna skip this one. And then when we look at method of homicide, so we have who's the spouse? Is it the husband or the wife? We see that men are most likely to use some type of a weapon versus a handgun, long gun, while women are more likely to offend using these methods. Where men, while they do use a high rate of these methods, they're also more likely to use things like strangulation, no weapon at all, or another type of weapon. And you can see this by the comparison of these numbers here with these numbers here. And these are associated with age. So the younger the spouse is, as far as being a wife, the younger they are, they're more likely that they can have a higher rate of things like strangulation or some other type of weapon besides a club, knife, or gun. So And then when we look at the association between age, so here we have husband as victim in this first graph, and then we have wife as victim in the second graph, okay? We have wife as an offender here, husband as an offender here, okay? So let's look at husband victims first. They're at highest risk between the age of 20 to about 65. When they're married to a female who is between the age of 20 and 55. Okay, does that make sense? You got that? Okay. Now for men to wife, so this is the wife is the victim. We can see that men have a wider range of when they'll commit. So we're talking teen, 15 or so, up to the age of 80. And the spouse has a wider range too, of between 20 to about 75. Okay. Now, I don't know about all of you, but there are some ones that I question. Okay. So this is, so on this one, this is the age of the male offender. So I've always wondered about this guy who was 98 or so and had a wife at the age of 45, or this 80, almost 85-year-old guy who had a wife at the age of 30. Those outliers kind of are interesting to me, but maybe that's just me. I think it'd be interesting to investigate those, but just saying, those are kind of some of the interesting dots on this graph. So. And this is, again, an illustration of the different methods that are used. So on this, the dotted line is the female was the victim by age, and the solid line, the male was a victim. So yeah, as you can see, males are more likely to be killed by a knife in their younger years, whereas females tend to be mid-age and up. When we look at handguns, women are more likely to be killed by a handgun in their younger years, where men tend to be middle-aged when a wife will use a gun. So these are just different ways to look at this. Again, at younger years, they tend to use more diverse methods, and then as we age, we use less diverse methods. So kind of an interesting way to see the risk based on age and type of weapon. Okay. So to end our conversation for tonight, the sad truth is when we analyze homicides, and this is kind of the point of tonight's lecture, at least for tonight, okay, is a scary truth, at least here in the United States, when we analyze homicide from an objective perspective, okay, we're more likely to be unsafe in our own home than walking down the street among strangers. And we're going to see this illustrated on Wednesday as we continue this conversation. Indeed, a person is 90% more likely to be killed by a family member or an intimate partner than a stranger. Which begs the question about things like stranger danger and why we lock our house from the inside instead of the outside. And so these are things of interesting debate, because we often don't think about these kinds of things and about where are we at most risk. But unfortunately, one of the safest places we should be is actually the one that puts us at the higher risk. Okay. So I'm going to, I know this, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm